will be made available in the next couple days. In addition, please be aware that we have muted all attendees and will be taking questions using the chat feature. Please feel free to send us your questions and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And we will now begin recording.
All set, Jessica.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. And just actually one quick little note to pop in, sorry. We actually don't have everyone muted automatically, so if you could just make sure that you do stay muted, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melinda. So, and then I will just get started right here in a second. So during this presentation, we'll be providing an overview of the SALC program, capacity program specifics, eligibility criteria, application process and timeline, and then we'll open up things for your questions. Before we get started with the presentation, we'd like to do a very quick survey just to get a general sense of how many organizations will be submitting applications. And there's that link right now in the chat. If you guys could take a quick minute. The results will not be visible to others or the public, and we understand how things may change. We just are aiming to get a general sense of how many applications we may be receiving to help us with our planning. And those 3 questions are just, do you plan on submitting an application for a SALC capacity grant? Will you be applying for a tier 1 up to $100,000 or a tier 2 up to $250,000? And if you have any additional comments, and please also add your organization name. And I will give you guys about a minute or so to go ahead and fill that out.
And let me know if anyone's having any problems with the link. It should be working. Maybe a thumbs up from a couple folks if you've been able to open it. That would be great. Just to confirm.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Looks like
Perfect.
Yeah, people are able to complete that. I'll give you guys another minute. Oh no, it looks like the chat or the link is not working for Terry.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I'll make note of what you put in the chat. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll also send it around a link to the survey with the follow-up materials. Maybe you can access it better from that link.
All right. Thank you so much, Melinda. Oh, go ahead. Did you have a question about the link? Oh, Erin, for you, did you? Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good.
I think we're good. Okay, so I will go ahead and get started again. So the Sustainable Agriculture Lands Conservation Program is a component of the California Strategic Growth Council's Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. The Department of Conservation, in conjunction with the Natural Resources Agency, administers the SALC program on behalf of the council. The principal goals of SALC are to protect agricultural lands that support infill and compact development, contribute to carbon neutrality, and build climate resilience, including through supporting sustainable land management practices. And it support coordinated land use planning, and also support the Executive Order N8220 by safeguarding the state's economic sustainability and food security, protecting biodiversity, enabling enduring conservation measures on working lands in partnership with land managers and natural resource user groups, and advancing equity and opportunity for all regions of California. The SALC program will award an amount equal to 10% of the auction proceeds available from the 20% continuously appropriated to the California Strategic Growth Council for the AHSC program from the Greenhouse Reduction Fund. In round 8, SGC awarded $74 million in funding for 24 easement projects, 20 capacity projects, and 3 planning projects. The actual funding level for fiscal year 2022-2023 will not be determined until after the 4th auction, which ends this month. The final amount will be determined and announced in September, and you can visit the Cap and Trade website if you are interested in seeing what the first 3 auction proceeds looked like to get a sense of how much funding might be available this round. And that link Melinda just put in the chat. There are 3 components to the SALC program, all focused on agricultural conservation, acquisition grants to permanently protect croplands, rangelands, and lands utilized for the cultivation of traditional resources from conversion to non-agricultural uses through the acquisition of voluntary permanent agricultural conservation easements or fee title purchases. And then there's the land use planning grants that support the development of local and regional land use policies and economic development strategies to protect critical agricultural lands. And then capacity and project development grants to expand organizational capacity to develop agricultural conservation acquisition projects. We'll be discussing the capacity and project development component of the program today. Anyone who missed our acquisition workshop can view and download the workshop slides online on our website. And Melinda just added that link to the chat. Or you can request a link to the video. If you have additional questions, you can also email us at salcp@conservation.ca.gov. And now we're going to go into the grants overview for capacity and project development. So the SALC capacity grants will be provided to build organizational and financial capacity to develop agricultural conservation acquisition projects. For example, developing a board or management structure to support informed decision-making and provide oversight over staff work and acquiring tools or resources to track projects and develop project materials. You can also use the funds to develop agricultural conservation easement and fee acquisition projects in preparation for submitting such projects for acquisition funding in future rounds and to cover associated costs to help close agricultural conservation acquisition projects where the cost of the acquisition is covered by an alternative source of funding. And for example, like staff time, baseline documentation, escrow costs, legal consulting, title reports are examples of eligible associated costs. Please review page 16 through 19 in the capacity section of the combined guidelines for the full list of eligible and ineligible costs. Please note some associated cost items are subject to department review and approval. And finally, funds can be used by federally recognized or non-federally recognized California Native American tribes to develop new 501c3 organizations like a tribal land trust that will partner with them to meet the goals of SALC. Also note that the agricultural conservation acquisition projects developed using this funding must meet the eligibility criteria within the acquisition sections of the guidelines to be considered for funding. SGC will aim to award up to 5% of the total funding dollars for capacity and project development grants, with additional monies to be made available for the same purpose in the next solicitation. Tier 1 up to $100,000 initially available to build organization and financial capacity to develop agricultural conservation acquisition projects. Tier 1 applicants may request an increase of funding up to a total grant award of $250,000 during their grant term if they can demonstrate the organizational and fiscal capacity to administer additional funds with their remaining grant term. Tier 2, up to $250,000 available for the grant term to expand on existing capacity and develop agricultural acquisition projects. And Tier 2 applicants must demonstrate organizational and financial capacity when they submit their application for funding. If you are not able to provide this documentation at the application stage, your application will be considered for Tier 1 funding. And tribal entities, requirements to demonstrate organizational and fiscal capacity to be eligible for a Tier 2 award or increase to a Tier 1 award may not apply to tribal applicants. The department will consult with tribal applicants to identify the most appropriate means for the individual federally recognized or non-federally recognized California Native American tribe to demonstrate eligibility. Please note, award increases are dependent on funding availability, and since the last solicitation, the requirements around number of staff have been removed. Eligible applicants include cities, counties, nonprofit organizations, RCDs, regional park or open space districts, regional park or open space authorities, and federally or non-federally recognized California Native American tribes that are on the contact list maintained by the Native American Heritage Commission. Nonprofit applicants must hold a tax exemption as defined under Section 501(c)(3) of the Internal Revenue Code. Nonprofit applicants for Tier 2 funding must have the conservation of agriculture, rangeland, or farmland among their stated purposes or as expressed in the entity's adopted policies. If a nonprofit applicant does not have the conservation of agriculture, rangeland, farmland, or tribal cultural resources among their stated purposes as is prescribed by the statute or as expressed in the entity's adopted policies, are eligible for Tier 1 funding on the condition that they use a portion of their funding, if awarded, to incorporate this language of conservation into their stated purposes or adopted policies. And also a quick note, applicants with active SALC capacity grants from round 8 are not eligible for funding unless the current grant is closed out before the application due date. And projects must meet all eligibility criteria to be considered for funding. Proposals must be from an eligible applicant for an eligible activity as defined in the guidelines and must demonstrate that the requested funding will increase the applicant's capacity to initiate and conduct agricultural land conservation activities. And now I will give it over to Cassidy to discuss the application process.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So I'll jump into our selection criteria here. Projects that meet all the eligibility criteria will be evaluated based on how well the proposal meets our program's goals, advances equity and opportunity, will be sustained after the life of the grant, and has a budget that reflects reasonable costs for the proposed activities. All applications received by the department will be evaluated based on the materials provided as of the application deadline, as well as a review of publicly available information as reasonable to verify the information that's been provided. While pre-proposals are not required, they are encouraged, but SALC program staff are available prior to the application deadline to provide technical assistance to eligible applicants that are interested in submitting an application. So if you don't submit a pre-proposal, we are still available to assist as you put your application together. Please note that the priority population benefits criteria for technical assistance and capacity is different from what you may be used to when submitting, say, an acquisition application. You can access this link in the capacity application packet, and we'll also be including a link to that table in the chat.
And I'll pop it in a quick sec. Just a quick note, this must have been a holdover from another presentation, so apologies for any confusion, but their pre-proposals are not part of the capacity program, so it's just the applications. So there's no pre-proposals, but there is the application. So just wanted to clarify that. Because I know with the planning grants, there are the pre-proposals, so.
Thank you, Melinda. And so then moving forward, we'll look at our capacity grant application materials. You may notice that DOC has changed the format of the application for capacity grants this year. Our application utilizes a fillable Word document format. So when you submit your application, please maintain the Word document format in order to ensure that there aren't any issues with information transfer or formatting. Also notably, there's a new budget template embedded within the application. We'll go over that a little bit more in our next slide here. So as you see on the screen in the application, you'll find the budget template has an Excel function. So what you'll want to do is just double click on the cell that you wish to fill out, and you'll see the Excel object table highlighted as shown here. So it's got kind of these hashes around it that lets you know that you've successfully gotten into that Excel object. I can also pop out as a separate Excel sheet. I've seen it do both, but basically you'll want to do the same thing either way, which is you'll fill out as you normally would, click on the Word document then to finalize the input details, and that'll return you to the rest of the application. This new template is embedded within the application in order to allow some flexibility in how funds are spent. So it's designed specifically to provide a little bit more flexibility, as we've seen is needed in the past. We've included a rate table which identifies not to exceed rates for staff. We do ask that you provide the higher end of the range for any positions in order to allow for potential hiring or raises during the grant term. And you'll also see that staff is identified in each line item. This is to allow for staff work within any of the task areas. And then jumping into our required application materials, applicants are required to complete all of the following as part of their application. So it includes the grant application checklist, cover sheet, an executive summary, responses to narrative questions, the applicant resolution of support, work plan, and budget. On the cover sheet, we do ask you to note whether match will be provided. Match isn't required for this component of the program and doesn't factor into our considerations. But if you do have match associated with the project, such as acquisition funding for projects you'd like us to cover the associated costs on, we'd like to know that. And then for the work plan and budget, we ask that you do your best to anticipate what your needs will be over the course of the grant, but we also know that things do change. So please just do your best to fill out the work plan and budget. And if you have questions, our staff is available to help. Also, if your proposal is funded, keep in mind that you're allowed to move up to 20% of costs between line items in your budget without having to request a grant amendment. So don't worry if things shift a little bit from what you propose in your application. If you end up needing to move more than 20% of the funds allocated around, we may be able to accommodate that via a more formal amendment process. And that's definitely something you'd want to let your grant manager know sooner than later, though, if that were not the case. So then moving on with further required application materials, we require documentation of organizational eligibility, maps of proposed project boundaries, if applicable, and the priority population benefits table if you're going to be applying for priority population status. As it relates to organizational eligibility, if you're a return applicant and you have your most current documents on file with the department, you can certify to that in your application rather than resubmitting those documents. If you're uncertain whether the current documents are on file, you can always email us before the application deadline to confirm that. As it relates to boundary maps, if you don't have any projects identified for development yet, that's fine. You wouldn't have to submit them in that case, obviously. And if you'll be applying for priority population benefits, we do request a table showing the criteria met. And then finally, for Tier 2 applicants, they must also submit documentation of organizational and fiscal capacity to administer the grant with the application. That's in order to be considered for $250,000 funding tier, that Tier 2. If you do not submit this documentation, your application may be considered for the $100,000 funding tier. So that's, you do have an option if you don't have that documentation available. The requirements to demonstrate organizational and fiscal capacity to be eligible for a Tier 2 award or an increase to a Tier 1 award may not apply to tribal applicants. And then in order to demonstrate organizational capacity, Tier 2 applicants, as stated previously, must provide evidence in their application that they have each of the following: a board and/or management structure that provides oversight over staff work, tools and resources to track projects and the expenditure of grant funds, such as grant management software, spreadsheets, financial tracking systems, GIS systems, etc., as well as professional staff who have the knowledge and expertise to successfully develop conservation acquisition projects. We would also request a staff timekeeping system with the capacity to generate reports that break time down by grant task and by person, as well as staff or a contractor sufficiently skilled to track project financials in a way that allows for efficient and accurate invoice submission. For our nonprofit applicants, they must also be accredited by the Land Trust Accreditation Commission or have adopted equivalent or greater policies regarding conflict of interest, amendment, monitoring, stewardship, endowments, and enforcement as relevant. And then finally, in order to demonstrate fiscal capacity to administer the grant, Tier 2 applicants must provide a copy of the current annual organizational budget, as well as a copy of the most recent financial audit. If an audit isn't available, a copy of the organization's recent financial statements would be sufficient. And with that, our capacity application deadline is due by 11:59 p.m. on Friday, July 21st. And again, we have our email address available here. If you do have any questions as you put together your application, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to assist and help out with getting these applications together. And with that, we're available for any questions or comments. We can take those from the chat. It looks like, I believe we had received one during the presentation, so I can start off with that. Looks like we had a question from Ag Land Trust regarding whether a Tier 2 grant can be used by a mature organization to complete the accreditation process through Land Trust Alliance.
Yes.
Let me take a. So I think that was Artemis jumping in here. It sounds like that would be possible. If we have any other questions, definitely feel free to either pop them in the chat or you can come off mute as well if that's easier for you.
I would also just like to add if, or reiterate, if, you know, you're trying to narrow your focus or see if one of the tasks that you would like to pursue may be eligible, please reach out to staff. We're more than happy to go over the plan, potential plans, and help you with that.
Thanks, Artemis. It looks like we received another question here asking how many grants an organization can submit. I believe it's just one, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's only allowed to be one active grant from any organization at a time. So if you had multiple acquisitions per se that you were interested in pursuing, you'd want to include those in the scope of a single grant.
Thanks, Cassidy. So it looks like we have another question. Do we need to identify specific, likely agricultural targets, and do we need to be in promising discussions with them before applying? So for the capacity grant, like this is to like build up your capacity so that you can go and reach out to like likely targets to then apply to the SALC program. So and please correct me if I'm wrong, but like we want to like build up your capacity to do that, so you don't have to have like a like specific like detailed proposals yet, but you should have some like idea. And like I said, anybody from our team, if you want to add anything else to that.
Yeah, that's correct, Jessica. So really just if you have an idea of where it is that you would like to target, include that, and you would include some outreach costs within one of the tasks in the work plan in order to do that work. If there's an area that, an area in your region that's been lacking and you just don't have the staff capacity to go out and target some of those areas, like disadvantaged communities, for instance, then that's really part of the process for this grant. And Carol, since I'm already on muted, no, the project does not have to last 3 years. I would recommend if the project is awarded that the grant term last 3 years, just in case anything happens and you need more time. It's easier to have that already written into the grant agreement for 3 years and not use it. Really, the grant is over when your deliverables are complete. So if that means that your deliverables are complete in a year and a half, then great, go ahead and send that final invoice, close out the grant, and you can go ahead and reapply for another round if you're interested in that. But no, it does not have to last all 3 years.
Yeah, it
And
looks
I
like
think we
there's
received
another. Yeah, go for it.
here. So the question is, how then does it impact our ability to apply for an acquisition grant? I think the intent being, you know, with your capacity grant, you would be preparing an application for a future acquisition round. Whether or not there's allowed to be overlap, so say you're still within your acquisition grant term or your capacity grant term and you want to apply for an acquisition grant, I don't think that there's any issue with that. So it should just be assistive. I don't think that it should necessarily in any way disallow you from applying for an acquisition while you're within this term. Artemis, feel free to jump in there if there's any more nuance to add to that.
Yeah, so the only thing to add is again, like the capacity grants, think of it as like the road to get you to an acquisition. right? At the end of the day, we would like to, or the funds are really to help conserve lands, right? So you can definitely have the two grants simultaneously, and if you include a task for project development, that's really the intent, is to have funds available to go out, do the outreach, talk to the landowners, do the pre-development of that project that you would like to submit for an acquisition project. And then where acquisition takes over is once the application for acquisition is submitted. And we would go ahead and mark one of the deliverables and the capacity is complete, if you did have project development within there.
And then we have another question here. Is there a list with summaries of grants awarded in this category? Just to clarify for that question, is that capacity grants that have been awarded thus far, or more general, the types of projects that we see utilizing capacity funds?
It's grants that have been awarded thus far previously.
Yeah, do we know if we have a list of that list publicly?
Yep.
Yes, we
if we
do.
just-
Yes, we do.
Yeah, and I'll pop a link into the chat. So if you go to our website, there's a link down at the bottom for awarded projects. And if you go to that page, you'll see for round 8, since capacity is really new, there's just one round that we've awarded. But if you go to that link, you can click on the project summaries, and there'll be a summary of that project there. If I can get it to get into the chat, my thing's not behaving, but so yeah, so you'll be able to look at it there. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Melinda.
So I popped a second link in there. So the first one just takes you to that page so you can peruse multiple rounds of awarded grants. And then the second one is a direct link to the PDF that has project summaries of all the projects from round 8. That should be helpful.
Great, thank you. And as stated previously, if you're thinking about putting together an application, not sure if your project scope would fit the terms of this grant, definitely reach out to us, review those documents, but we're here to help with that as well. So I think we've got a question here. Could you help distinguish between the planning grant and the capacity grant? Seems both to intend to lead to an acquisition grant. So I can start with answering this one, and definitely if any of my colleagues would like to jump in and provide additional information, that'd be great. But essentially, there's a few key differences. The eligible applicant is one that's a little bit different, so who the grant is generally geared towards. Our planning grants are often geared towards jurisdictions who are creating plans, working with partner agencies to develop larger scale planning strategies that can include acquisitions as a part of that. But it's a little bit more larger in scope and generally is more geared towards governmental agencies rather than, say, land trusts, although they definitely have a part. And then the capacity grants are more geared towards our land trust, smaller agencies developing capacity to be able to bring acquisitions forward, whether through SALC or even through other programs, so long as they're projects that would also be eligible for SALC funds. So there's one key difference there. If anybody else wants to jump in and has anything else to add there, that'd be great as well.
Thanks, Cassidy. No, I think that was great overview of the distinction. I mean, so at the end of the day, for example, with a planning grant, you might end up with like a general plan, recent update of their agricultural element of their general plan. And at some point, they may also have, say, like some sort of prioritization of areas that ultimately they'd like to see they'd like to see protected, but it's more in terms of policy, not necessarily in terms of an acquisition, where at the end of the day, these lead to, the capacity grants are really focused on that, on the acquisition piece itself. So hopefully that distinction makes sense. And then also in the PDF that I sent you can see examples of some of the planning grants that were awarded to kind of get a sense of the distinction there. I think the term, it gets confusing because the term planning is sort of general. And so, I'm glad you brought that up. It's good to have that conversation because I do think some people are a little confused by the two and the potential overlap there. So thank you for that question. You're welcome, Carrie. I think we could probably let folks head off to lunch if there's no more questions. Happy to stay on if you do have any more. Thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and yes, thanks Melinda and Cassidy and Artemis for all your help with everything and answering questions. And like I said in the chat, we'll be here for a little bit longer if you guys have questions. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to reach out to us via email if you have more questions.
And the slides via email. I think we had a question back here, as well as the presentation recording.
Perfect. Thank you. I was just going to say that. Yeah, we'll send an email out this afternoon with a link to the recording and the slides to everyone that registered. So for those that attended, but also those that registered.
Melinda, and I believe, will the presentation recording also be provided online as well? Is that where the link is provided from?
I will be sending a link to the recording in the email that I follow up. It won't be, the slides will be linked on the homepage, but not the recording.
Great, thank you. And so that's a way as well forward that recording along. It should be accessible to anybody in the public. So we'll send it out to attendees.
And folks that registered as well. Yeah, it has a short shelf life. So, and I'll note that in the, usually we just have the recordings available for a short time because they have, they need to be updated as time goes on. So, yeah. And with that, I think I will stop recording.
Oh, you know what? It looks like we have one more question from Carrie Waterman in the chat. And it looks like she just asked, and can the land being conserved and the aims of a grant be actively used for agricultural purposes? So, so yeah, that's actually one of our main goals for the acquisition grants for SALC, is that they are conserved in perpetuity to stay in like the agricultural businesses. Is that what you were asking? Okay, yes.